So welcome everyone. Welcome to Santa Barbara Hillel. I'm Josh Levine, the Executive Director here at Santa Barbara Hillel. And before we get started, I just want to share a few words about what we do here and the importance of today's event. And it's so good to see so many of you here. So in my 6 months here, I've been wowed by the strength and community found here in Santa Barbara. At Hillel, we're the hub of Jewish campus life. We show up for students and are here for them as they stand up for their rights and their values. And together we build a community of purpose, of joy, of inclusion, of growth. And we connect the Jewish community here to the broader world, from Santa Barbara to California, to Israel, the Middle East, and around the globe. On the afternoon of October 7th, a non-Jewish student stopped by Hillel, as they often do. And a non-Jewish student stopped by to place flowers outside of our door. And when I thanked him and invited him to join the group that was gathering inside, he said he just wanted the Jewish community at the time to know that he and his friends were thinking of us. So these days, as we all can't help but hear the loud voices on the news, on social media, and certainly on campus, it's the everyday moments of connectedness, of relationship building, of shared humanity, even of grace, that will advance the value of tikkun olam, of repairing the world, and propel us all forward together. So, right around October 7th, the Torah portion, Genesis, had words that thousands of years later would become the University of California's motto: let there be light. So in a world where there is darkness, in a world of so much heat, the Taubman Symposium is a key way, as Mr. Makovsky said this afternoon to a group of students, it's a key way we shine not just heat, but light. So today we turn down the temperature and we enjoy the privilege of learning together. May our pre-existing narratives be challenged. May our knowledge be deepened. Thanks to Deborah A. Taubman for her and her family's long-standing support and their vision for this important kind of learning. Thank you to Professor Rothfar, Professor Hecht, Noah Weiss, the Taubman team for taking the lead in making today possible, and the support of Hillel International and our staff for today's programs. And of course, thank you to our distinguished speakers, Mr. Makovsky and Mr. Al-Omari. And thanks to all of you for joining us at Santa Barbara Hillel for what promises to be a really enlightening afternoon. So to make the introductions and get us underway, I'd like to welcome Professor Lee Rothfar, Program Director of the Taubman Symposium.
Thank you, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here in person finally and see all the faces, not electronically, but actually physically here. Looking at a lot of little squares is one experience, but it's much better, much more effective to be here and see everybody physically present. As Josh mentioned, this is a co-sponsored event from the Taubman Symposia in Jewish Studies, Congregation B'nai B'rith, CBB for short, and the Santa Barbara Hillel. When I heard that the two men were going to be in our geographical location, I thought here would be a real opportunity to try and bring everybody together. It is a fortunate confluence of stars that CBB didn't have anything going on, neither did Hillel, and neither did we. We did have the Taubman Symposium last week with Omar Bartov, and this one comes a week later, but we felt this was significant enough to do 2 weeks in a row. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session. As Josh mentioned, I'm the new program director. The former program director sits beside me here and is going to act as moderator today. I'd like to introduce him briefly. Richard Hecht, now Professor Emeritus for 4 years?
49.
No, how long have you been emeritus? How long have you been emeritus?
Oh, emeritus. 49.
I tried to suppress that, but it didn't work. But Richard Hecht has really been the face of the Taubman Symposia for many, many years, on to 30 years practically, and brought our speakers on other occasions many times for the so-called Israeli-Palestinian Dialogues, a very effective program. So we had a lunch today. That was one of the other events in these 3-event series while they're here. And now we have a series of questions formulated by Professor Hecht, and he will present them to our two speakers to have a kind of dialogue. And I hope you will also have some questions that you want to bring up or spin off on something that he has brought in order to deepen our understanding of this very complicated situation. So, without further ado, and needing no further introduction, Professor Emeritus Richard Hecht to introduce our new speakers.
This is working. You know, I must tell you, I haven't spoken to a group this large in a long, long time.
It's not on.
That doesn't mean I haven't spoken to large groups, but I just had cataract surgery. And you get these marvelous glasses. When you put them on, 30 people all of a sudden become 100. We now have so many Rabbi Steve Cohen. You know, I can't believe it. You know, one of them can retire, the others. So I say that only because I did write a formal introduction to our speakers. I've known them for 15 years. We've been doing this kind of discussion with students for 15 years. The dialogue that David and Ray founded here in 2009, they've taken to many other campuses. And while things are different in this context today than in years past, it doesn't mean that the significance of having two people talk as scholars, as activists, as negotiators, people who really know the ground of Israel-Palestine in very serious ways cannot help but inform us. So then, rather than give you a formal introduction, I commend you to look again at the announcement of this talk, where the biographies of each of these important individuals is given. I simply want to say a personal word about each of them. And so with David Makovsky, whose writings have achieved a great deal of popular acclaim, he also, and I recommend this to you as an extraordinary resource, is his Decision Points, which is an Apple podcast that is going into its 5th year. And some of the episodes of that podcast are really significant, really significant. Now, I'm like you, I look at a lot of podcasts, and most of them are garbage, right? Well, they're not that serious, but when you open Decision Points, you'll find a treasure trove of very exciting pieces of scholarship and discussion. So I recommend that as one of the accomplishments that you've had over 4 years. And if you ever want to find out about the rise of the right, I commend you to look at the podcast episode on the rise of the right, or on Abraham Yitzhak Cohen Kook, extraordinary presentation on the origins of religious Zionism, its transformations. And then with Ghaith al-Omari, I must tell you that we have a secret. The reason we can get Ghaith here, along with David, is because of tequila. And
what can I say?
we enjoy sipping tequila occasionally on his visits, and I always try to find a new tequila to sip with him before he arrives. And Ghaith is someone who actually understands both sides in a way that perhaps is without parallel in anyone that I know of in discussions about the Middle East. So it's wonderful to have the two of you here again. I wish we could have you every day, but certainly this afternoon I think will help us better understand the situation. We decided that we would have 3 questions that I will pose, and each of them will respond to it. And at the end of those 3 questions, which I think should be around 3:45, 3:50, we'll open it up to public discussion. So the first of our questions, because you know the title of today's discussion is the Israel-Hamas war, policy, issues, and public opinion. So we're stressing issues of policy and public opinion. So the first question really is about public opinion that I posed to the two of you. And that is for you to think about public opinion in the region and share with us your thoughts about how public opinion is changing, is perhaps influencing the situation on all the sides that you think are important.
All right, so, first I want to thank Richard very much for hosting and seeing familiar faces. It's an honor to be back here. I mean, I know people find this hard to believe, but what Richard said, it was the University of California, Santa Barbara, UCSB. This was the first campus where Rafe and I spoke together. And I think we've done 70 or 80 campuses since that visit in 2009. And we had a tradition here, I think, I don't know, 7 years running with the Taubman Center and, with Hillel and certainly with Richard on campus of doing this like reverse dialogue. We didn't just come for one day, we were here for 3 days, and we would have a situation where we would have the Jewish students, they would be part of the Palestinian negotiating team, and we'd have Muslim American students, they were part of the Israeli negotiating team. And I think a light bulb would always go off, and people said there was always one moment in this 3-day thing where people are poring over maps and getting into a lot of the nuances about the West Bank, where I certainly would get people, and I'm sure you got it too, Ray, on the Israeli team, on the Palestinian team, but I would have Muslim Americans come up to me and said, I never realized this conflict was so complicated. And that to me was a success. When people realize that complexity is at the center, and Muslim Americans say, no one ever taught us it was so complicated. One said, I thought it was a bumper sticker. And so I'm sure Rafe had the same experience. But really, I really think UCSB will always have a role in our hearts, if I could speak for Rafe and myself, because it all started here. And so we feel like it's almost a home away from home. So we want to thank you and for having us back. And look, on the issue of the day, which is kind of what I call the nexus between the policy and the politics. Where's the public? And maybe I'll do more kind of observations about Israel, Rafe will do more about the Arab world, and then we'll feel free to comment on the other side as well. Look, I think if you look in terms of Israel now, if I'm looking at that part, and I pour over public opinion data, I want to just get there was a fresh poll just yesterday of the Israel Democracy Institute, and some polls are better than others, and that's a very good one, by the way, Israel Democracy Institute. What's clear is that for the Israeli public, this is the embodiment of a just war. There's none of the major fissures that we saw at one point in the Lebanon War of 1982, which was more controversial. Internally in Israel, there's a sense that this has been going on for many years. The world doesn't see it because the world has got other issues. There could be climate issues, mudslides, there could be a lot of different things going on in the world, but in Israel, they've been living with this. And in Israel's view, in '94, I wrote a book on Oslo, on Israeli decision-making. They feel they got out of Gaza, they turned it over to the PA in '94. They then pulled the settlers out of Gaza in 2005. But in 2007, Hamas outmaneuvered the Palestinian Authority, and that was a turning point, and we've never gotten the train back on the rails from 2007. We've been living in the shadow of 2007, and Hamas has been in control. And then Israel felt they're still firing rockets. Well, then we got a blockade to make sure they can't fire rockets. And again, in terms of Israeli public opinion, they're out. I know a counter-argument says, yeah, but they have, the airspace off the shore. But clearly, I think if the Hamas would say, we're going to show a model Palestinian society in Gaza, it would have put enormous pressure on Israeli public opinion for more withdrawals in the West Bank. after the 2005 pullout of Gaza, and by the way, pulling out of 4 Israeli settlements in the West Bank. So, in the Israelis, every time Hamas makes a statement that we will never accept you, we hate, you know, you're illegitimate, the Israeli public hears that. And so when October 7th happens and there's rapes and beheadings and people being burned alive, and the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, as the ultimate pogrom, yes, they have their complaint against the state, that the state had a systemic collapse, there's no word around it, that's the truth. But their view is, you know, the United States wouldn't live with ISIS down the street. Obama, I worked in the Obama administration, we went 7,000 miles against ISIS, and Biden says this is even worse than ISIS in terms of the beheadings of kids and things like that. So in the Israeli public opinion, this is a very just war. Now, I think they are aware, because I monitor Israeli TV in Hebrew every day, primetime newscasts. I try to do multiple stations if possible, if there's time. But it's clear that the public wants Israel to go further. And now the President Biden has articulated a different approach, which has been that there's Hamas is over here, the Palestinian public is over there, and do whatever you can to drive Hamas from power, but make sure innocent people are not hurt. That's a position many of us identify with. In Israel, sometimes those public opinion lines are much blurrier because they see the public has been supportive of Hamas. Now, I would say, okay, but the people haven't really had a chance to voice their opinion because Hamas, if you fire the shots over there, you call the shots. And so the public can't really act independently of the public. But the public, the numbers, I just looked at some new, fresh numbers from yesterday. You know, they want Israel to finish the job. They see there's 4 battalions left against Hamas in the last city in Rafah. But they didn't say when they want to finish. The U.S. has certainly said during the month of Ramadan that started last night, we don't think it's a good idea. We want to see a plan for the evacuation of 1.3 million Palestinians so they're out of harm's way. And maybe the plan will be developed during Ramadan, and if there's an attack, what would happen after Ramadan. The public opinion has not gotten into that level of nuance. But the public is not really attacking the Prime Minister from the right. They're upset with the Prime Minister on certain things. They think he acts sometimes out of personal interest. They're not happy with him. They feel they want him to be more of a unifier, not a divider. And they know he has to navigate a hard right part of his coalition that's complicating things. They love the fact that Benny Gantz of the Center Party is in the government, because 2 former chiefs of staff, people with a lot of experience, cool heads, and that they're a corrective to this hard right element. So they want Gantz and Eisenkot, the 2 former chiefs of staff, to stay in the government. So if we're looking at kind of, does the public opinion have a role, or are they moving Israel hard to the right? I don't think they're moving them hard to the right. They want unity in the country, but they want the government to succeed in the war, which they see as very just, which is driving Hamas from power. They're not yet focused really in high definition about what's the day after going to look like in any significant way. They're focused on the here and now. I do think they give the government broad berth room on tactics, what to do. So if certainly this defense establishment, and you'll hear this from Rafe and me, has been often a moderating force, which has said, listen, we don't think it's a good idea, for example, on the Temple Mount, or the Haram al-Sharif, to put restrictions on Israeli Arabs to pray during Ramadan, even if this is what Sinwar wants, that Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, I think he wants to use Ramadan to light up the Middle East. Maybe if he fails in these next couple of weeks, he'll be more amenable to the hostage for cause deal that the United States is trying to broker. Right now, I think he thinks it's a second chance at October 7th. This is such an ultra-sensitive time. You know, maybe we could light up the Middle East in a negative way, just inflame it and ignite it, and maybe he'll fail. The defense establishment is saying to the Prime Minister, cool it. Like, let's make sure there's no restrictions on Israeli Arabs, people under 50. The more we put restrictions on for maybe very legitimate security concerns, it will be spun around in the Arab media as trying to prevent prayer and free expression. Don't do it. And the public, I think for the most part, is rallying around the defense establishment where they say, ease up on those things. So I think when the defense establishment expresses a view, the public tends to go for it. The public is really not that ideological. The public just has one motto: we want to be safe. Anybody that is seen as doing that, getting rid of Hamas from power, or if the Shin Bet says do this tactically on the Temple Mount, they will follow whoever wants them to be safe. And that, I think, if that is the key thing in understanding Israeli public opinion. I could talk for hours, but I want to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Ghaith al-Omari.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, let me just echo what David started with. It's always such a pleasure to be here. There's always going to be a special place in our hearts for this. Our professional relationship did not start here, but certainly got deepened here. Ultimately became a personal friendship, and this is no small part of it. My only complaint, Richard, is, did you really have to talk about tequila on the first day of Ramadan? No, but seriously. Okay. To the question now about public opinion. I've just come back from 2 weeks ago. I came back from a trip to the Middle East. I was in Egypt, Saudi, Jordan, and Israel. And what really struck me is there are two different universes that exist in that region. What David mentioned about Israel is absolutely accurate. This is the sense that I got talking both to kind of officials and non-officials in Israel. But in the Arab world, it's a different reality. And one thing that really struck me, before I go deeper into the public opinion, is, I sit in my hotel room in Israel, I turn on the TV, I don't speak Hebrew, but I look at the images, and the images are all of a fallen soldier or of the hostages. This is it. This is what they see. This is what Israeli media is projecting all the time. It makes perfect sense. Israel has gone through one of its most traumatic, actually probably its most traumatic moments since the creation of the state, and it's only natural that it reacts this way. Now you go to the Arab world, and it doesn't matter which of the capitals you go to, and turn on the TV, and it's a completely different set of images that you see. You see major destruction in Gaza, you see people dying of starvation, you see civilians being killed, you see actions by individual Israeli soldiers which go beyond what is acceptable in the rules of war, and the image that they see is an image of basically all of the suffering in Israel, in Gaza, and none of what the Israelis are going through. This has been the case since October 7th. You'll be amazed how few Arabs actually know what happened on October 7th. I was having a conversation with actually a Saudi young woman when I was in Saudi Arabia. Asked her, do you know what happened on October 7th? And she said, yeah, Hamas went into Israel, attacked some military camps, and got some prisoners of war. Did you hear about the rapes, the killings, etc.? This is not there. This is not in the media. So public opinion is really shaped based on what is the data and information that you're exposed to, and clearly two sets of data, two sets of information, creating two very different sets of public opinion. Today, I think if you look at what is the policy outcome of all of this, is you end up with a huge political pressure on Arab leaders to end the war tomorrow. If not today, then tomorrow. The idea, asking for a permanent ceasefire, is something that is almost a unanimous demand among different Arab public opinions. And public opinion in the Arab world matters. You can say, oh, these are monarchies, these are non-democratic systems, and you'll be absolutely right in saying so. Yet, public opinion does matter in these. It's actually, in some ways, it matters maybe more than democracies, because there's always concern, especially after the Arab Spring, that if you don't pay attention, things might explode. I know, for example, the Saudis have 7 agencies that monitor public opinion. I know the Jordanian, the palace, has a polling that happens every 2 weeks, just to get a sense, and so forth and so on. This creates a set of very contradictory, if you wish, policy positions. Today you sit with the Arab officials privately, and especially in the intelligence and military world, they will tell you in the same sentence, we believe that Hamas should be defeated. Some will say it should be defeated because they see it as an extension of Iran. One very senior intelligence officer said to me, if Hamas is defeated, this will be the first time that Iran is defeated, Iran proxy is defeated on the battlefield. You talk to Egyptians, they will tell you that Hamas is an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood. So each for their own reasons wants Hamas to be defeated. Yet in the same sentence, they will tell you, and we want a ceasefire tomorrow. So you have, this is, to me this shows that there are two sets of objectives. Some are political, some are policy oriented, that have tension between them. So that's kind of part of it. Now, if you go down, maybe I'll take it a step back. Putting aside the policy impact, this is also creating a very, in my mind as well, a very uncomfortable position as an Arab, I have to say, in Arab public opinion. Today, it would be a mistake and it would be a lie if I were to say that Hamas is not popular. Today, Hamas is popular. Certainly among the Palestinians, it is popular. There's a vision, there's an image that basically Israel doesn't understand anything but force, and Hamas showed them that it can do that. Though ironically, or maybe not so ironically, today Hamas is much more popular in the West Bank than it is in Gaza, because Gazans actually know what Hamas is. But in the Arab world in general, there was a sense that year after year after year of negotiation and diplomacy, the Palestinian issue became ignored, and now with this attack, the Palestinian issue is center stage. So we do have a problem with this, and unfortunately, you have a situation where many of the Arab governments feel so threatened by their public opinion that they are not taking a leadership position in having clarity vis-a-vis Hamas and vis-a-vis what happened on October 7th. Only one Arab country condemned Hamas by name, and that's Bahrain, though the Emiratis came close to it, and most religious authorities, with the exception of the Saudis, have justified, if not encouraged, a repeat of what happened on October 7th. So we do have a deeper problem there. Two last kind of comments here. While this is the case today, there is a pattern that I've seen in previous wars. And remember, this is the fourth or fifth Hamas-Israel war, depends how you count. Hamas is very popular when the war is happening, rally around the flag kind of dynamic. It tends to plummet once the war is over and people see what's happening, and we're seeing this actually happening almost in real time today. More and more criticism of Hamas, particularly coming from people in Gaza. And for someone today to publicly criticize Hamas in Gaza, it tells you how the degree of anger, because if you publicly criticize Hamas, more likely than not you'll be disappeared in the next day or two. So this is kind of the first thing. The second thing which I find, which is another kind of ray of hope to my mind, is this is the first Hamas-Israel war that I've seen space in Arab media for voices which are critical of Hamas. I can tell you for myself, in the previous wars, when I would go on a TV channel and say Hamas is a terrorist organization, which is my position, I would never be invited again to that station. With this war, there's actually space for voices like mine, and not only voices like mine. We're seeing a lot of op-eds that are basically, and speakers basically questioning what is happening. And this is because there is a major shift happening within the Arab world. If you go today to places like the UAE, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, etc., you will see that these countries understand that radicalization in all of its different stripes is a threat to their national interest. And they've been engaged, particularly the UAE and Bahrain, and Saudi is following suit now, in long-term education that actually is countering extremism, and that is creating this particular space. Yet the picture is not all rosy, because if you look on the other side, you still see a very proactive incitement machine. Maybe the most obvious of it is Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is a Qatari-owned and funded pan-Arab satellite that makes the Hamas spokesman look like, the Hadassah women of New York in terms of, so we have a competition of ideas and a competition of narratives happening in the Arab world when it comes to this. And a question we have to ask ourselves in this country, what can we do to empower the more moderate voices, and what can we do to punish, let's say, the less positive voices? The one thought I will leave you with is all of this creates a very, very complex background for any policy making that has to be done right now in the region, and for us here who are involved and who have to take into account the interests and the concerns of our regional partners.
Let me see now if I can. And by the way, about the beginning of Ramadan, I didn't offer you anything last night.
Correct.
So, the next question I have is that there's a great deal of discussion if there is a new government in Israel. How might that change things? How might that alter the direction of Israel's policy within the state, and also its relationship to the Palestinians and the larger Arab world, and also towards the United States?
Okay, thank you. Just to reinforce what Ghaith said, I mean, really, people are watching two different wars. I mean, that's really one of the takeaways you should take from this session, is that, you know, you flip Israeli TV, and they're very critical of Bibi on this. They feel he's mishandled the United States on this, and so I mean, it's not like they follow a governmental line at all. They are very critical, but I think they find it demoralizing to show often the suffering on the other side. And just like in the Arab world, you know, they're not gonna focus a lot on the hostages or focus on rocket fire into Israel or anything like that. So these people are watching two different narratives, two different wars, essentially. That's point one. And also, to underscore what Ghaith said about the Gulf, and this is really a shift, and I think for the two of us, too, because we both grew up, I'm a little older than Ray, but we both grew up to see an Arab world, you know, very seized by grand ideologies. You know, Nasserism, Pan-Arabism was one phase. And then when that didn't work, Islamism was another phase. What's happened in the Gulf is it's all about success. It's all about, you know, economic success, and it's much more focused on, don't give me these grand ideologies. And I go, let's say I've made 5 trips now to the UAE, and Dubai, and Abu Dhabi. And that's where the money is, in the, you know, so this center of gravity is shifted to the Gulf. So when the Gulf are the ones taking the lead on peace with Israel, the Abraham Accords, you know, the UAE and Bahrain, and now if the U.S. can pull off what I call the super duper Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia, it reflects a generational shift of younger people who said, don't give me these big ideologies. I want to know, what does it take to be successful? It's a much more pragmatic view, and it's also hopeful. If there is de-radicalization, that there is some homegrown efforts on curriculum, credentialing of imams, things that to you might sound very gray and esoteric, but who could be credentialed to be a Muslim leader, you know, in a mosque? The UAE has its own credentialing, and the de-radicalization, and could you import some of that to impact public opinion on the Palestinian side? I think there does have to be, and I was saying to a few students at lunch, there needs to be authentic Palestinian leaders who want that, just as after World War II in Japan and Konrad Adenauer in Germany, there were kind of indigenous, authentic voices that said, we want de-radicalization. And that will be key too. If it's viewed as imposed by Israel, I don't think it's going to work. So to the extent that there is now an alternative form, if you could import schools of excellence in science and math that are existing in the Gulf and bring this to Gaza, I think this would be fantastic. So I do think public opinion could be shaped, but I think it's going to take time, and it has to be seen as not imposed from without. But if the Arab countries would take a role, I think this would be wonderful. Now, to your question, Richard, about a new Israeli government, what would a Gantz-led government, let's say, look like? And again, I was saying about Benny Gantz, you know, he's former chief of staff, and Gadi Eisenkot, who we at the Washington Institute got to know very well because he was a visiting fellow. I got to sit with him for an hour a day for 6 months, and he's an extraordinary guy. I mean, he's a person of great judgment, great character, great integrity. My wife is actually here in the audience. She never comes to my campus thing, but she's come all the way from Washington. And she can tell you about Gadi. I mean, these are the sorts of people you'd be very proud of to be leaders in Israel. No one can say it's about personal ambition. It's about what country first. And so I think if you had Gantz and Eisenkot are running like 37 seats in the poll, just to give you a sense, the Knesset, the parliament, is 120. Any coalition needs 61. No party has been able to do this on its own since the founding of Israel in 1948 and its first election in 1949. But to get 37 seats is a huge head start. Netanyahu was at 32 before the last election in November 2022, and now in the polls he's at about 16. It started the downward descent over a controversial judicial reform, they called it, which was very controversial because it was seen as weakening the courts as an independent pillar of Israel. And you know, the fact that Israel was seen as ill-prepared, and that really the systemic collapse on October 7th has reinforced this. And so right now, if you just say, what is the scene now? Yes, I mean, before going to October 7th, the government had 64 out of 120. Again, 61 is the limit. You need a bare majority. But they were able to entice in Gantz and Eisenkot to have their 12 seats. So the number's really, let's say, 76 today. But Bibi is convinced, because he's also somewhat paranoid. He thinks, and maybe for a reason, but he feels Gantz and Eisenkot are going to leave to run against him in the next election. So he's going to say, okay, you know, I'm back to 64. I'm once again held hostage, so to speak, by a hard right. I have to be solicitous of their views. So the question is, what if Gantz was able to create a government without the hard right, meaning Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, two of the leaders of the hard right? What would that look like? I think it would be something that would be much more acceptable, certainly to the United States. I think the U.S. understands that there's legitimate security concerns. I said this on PBS NewsHour recently. I said, if the Palestinian state looked like Costa Rica, that was demilitarized, everybody would sign up for it, except the ideologues. If the state looks like a mini Iran, nobody's going to sign up for it. And the problem is Israel got out of Gaza, got out of Lebanon, and got rockets. So the Israeli view is, if you didn't like the book, you don't want to see the movie. But if Gantz could lead a much more security-focused view of a Palestinian state that says, listen, here are our criteria on enforcement. We want to know that this state is safe. I think they could bring people with it. The problem is, any government where Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the hard right, hold the center, the balance of power, they're not really focused on the security aspects of it. They're focused on, I think, their ideology, which is their view is this is biblical patrimony, and therefore it is not just misguided to have a Palestinian state, it is illegitimate. That's their point, and that's a huge distinction if something's illegitimate to just misguided. And their view is, you know, that we're not leading in that direction, no way. We're not in a government that could even entertain this. I think a Gantz government would entertain it if it met security criteria, and I think that's something the White House gets. And I just happened, I was just on an Arab satellite TV between the lunch thing and this event, and I said to them, I sat with Gantz last week when he was in Washington. I had an hour with him before he saw Kamala Harris, the vice president of the White House. Dennis Ross and myself met with him. And it's clear he would like an election. It's clear he is also viewed as an acceptable interlocutor because, you know, people see the things that he cares about is about security. I said, but just know, look at the polling data, 59 to 33% of his voters don't want him to leave the government. They don't want him to leave. Why? Because they said the war isn't over. The war is still going on. You haven't caught Sinwar. You haven't caught the 6 leaders of Hamas. The hostages are still in these dungeons, 134. Who knows how many are alive? And sadly, I think relatively few are alive. But they are still there. And his government is about what they call Hamachaneh Mamlachti, which is no good translation in English, but I would call it the state first camp, country first camp. And they say, okay, country first. There's a war, stay in the government. Then you can run. So if they would win, and Gantz said to me, he said, look, David, he said, I would join a government with Bibi. Again, he said it again, even all that Bibi's done to him and tried to undermine him and pull the rug out from under him, he said, I just will not sit with the hard right. I can't do it. It's bad for our country. And if it's a center, center-right, if I win, I'm the prime minister. If he wins, it's right-center, and then he's the prime minister. Is it pleasant for me with him? No, but I do it for the good for the country. We can do it. We can work together. But I can't do it if it's under this kind of a configuration. I'm doing it now because there's a war on. And when there's a war, everybody rallies around. But he didn't rule out a unity government. Clearly, I think if he would be the leader, he would have a much more, here are my security criteria for a state. It's not ideology, it's just about what is safe for Israel. And I think that's something the Biden administration could work with, personally.
Just a couple of reactions to what you said. I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. There was an Arab generation that basically look at the issue of Palestine as, their parents or grandparents' problem. Well, this war has changed it. And I think this war has been a formative moment for many of the kind of young Arab generation, and this is a new factor that we're seeing now in the political equation. And that's why, for example, when the Saudis before October 7th, when they're talking about reconciliation or a peace deal with Israel, the asks on the Palestinian issue were very minimal. Today they've become much higher because you have a new generation that has now who has opinions which are formed, and the opinions are not particularly favorable when it comes to Israel. 2 points on Israel, and here just to kind of reinforce what you said, David. First of all, my own impression is that while Israel has gone much harder to the right in terms of security, and I think it will be there for a very, very long time, I don't believe Israel has gone harder to the right in terms of ideology. I see nothing to indicate that's the case, and that actually creates a very interesting space in terms of where do you go forward. I think from now on a security-heavy process should be the way to think of it. But I think also Israeli politics will take a very long time to settle for 2 reasons. First of all, something like October 7th just does not you cannot go back to business as usual, politically speaking. And I suspect Israel will go through huge transformations in the way that politics is done in Israel. But also, I would add to this that before October 7th, Israel was, you mentioned the judicial overhaul or reform or whatever you want to call it. I think that was indicative of a much deeper question in Israel, the nature of the state, what kind of a state is in the future. And yes, today the war has created a moment of national unity, but these questions have not disappeared. We'll see them on the Haredi draft, we'll see them elsewhere. For these issues to settle, it will take a number of years, assuming you have the kind of, a centrist government that can work through this for a number of years. So it will be a while until we see any clarity on the Israeli side, and with that, any clarity when it comes to how do you deal with major foreign policy issues like the Palestinian issue and things of this sort.
Perhaps you have the same question in mind that I do at this point. This is not, by the way, the third question, but it's just something I want to ask at this point, because both of you have spent a great deal of time thinking about and talking to us about public opinion. But how would you understand the public opinion within the Israeli-Palestinian Arab population?
Actually, this is fascinating. And again, here we're talking about Israeli Arabs or Palestinians of Israel, or whatever the right terminology is these days. I think there was a process that was already ongoing before October 7th. You've seen more integration of Arab Israelis in the Israeli system. Any of you who go to Israel, go to a pharmacy, more likely than not that the pharmacist will be an Arab Israeli. You'll see the same in legal profession, etc., etc. So I think you're starting to see this, and already you started to see this having political expression. When you had someone like Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Islamic movement southern branch of Israel, doing what no other Arab Israeli party have done in the past, and be willing to be part of an Israeli coalition, it tells you that there is a shift. By the way, I saw Mansour on this trip, and basically he said that he believes that if he's a member of another coalition in the future, things are ripe for him to be a cabinet minister, not only an outside member of the coalition. So I think there is an evolution. Now, two things happened as well that I think added to the identification of many of the Israeli Arabs with being Israeli. And there's a recent poll, I can't remember who it was done with, I don't know if it was IDI or someone else, but basically they said the majority identified first as Israeli and then as, fill the blank. And part of it is also a sense, October 7th differentiate between being Jewish and being Arab. Many Arab Israelis were killed on October 7th. There are Arab Israelis right now, particularly from the south, who are hostages in Gaza. This, I think, was kind of an aha moment for many Arab Israelis when it comes to the way that they saw Israel, and I think also the fact that the previous Israeli government, the Bennett-Lapid government, was doing some very interesting work and interesting messaging to Arab Israelis, created identification. Now, the flip side of this, of course, is the Ben-Gvirs and Smotriches of this world. Because there's also, as this is happening, you see an empowerment of some of these elements, which, by the way, are not only anti-Palestinian in the messianic sense, but also have a very serious, I would call racist approach to Arab Israelis. So I think many of these Arab Israelis right now are torn between these two. The way that I think Israeli politics in general moves, meaning are these Israeli people sidelined or not, will influence how integrated these Arab Israelis are, but the trajectory that I see so far is actually quite encouraging.
I would just add on this one. Look, that IDI poll, that when they asked Israeli Arabs, I believe it was IDI, maybe it was Hebrew U, but it was like, do you identify with the state and its challenges? The numbers after October 7th among Israeli Arabs went from 48 to 70%. And that is incredible. Because that's something I think you don't feel here always. But that is partly because I think, A, Israeli Arabs were killed by Hamas on October the 7th. And it was a reminder, they don't want to live under Hamas. They would rather live under the state of Israel. And I think that's not a small moment. Also, Mansour Abbas, we have like a mutual admiration society for Mansour Abbas. And on almost every trip to Israel, I go see him. And for the first time in 75 years, I feel the Jews don't get much of a break in history. They got a break. They got a guy like Mansour, who is a true leader. And for the first time in 75 years, he gets up in Arabic, says, listen, this state is founded as a Jewish state. Of course, we're citizens of the state. We have a right to services in the state. But let's not fool ourselves and believe we're going to change the character of the state. We're citizens, we deserve more services, but the character of the state is going to remain Jewish, and he's fine with that. Well, would he be the one to create that state as an Arab in 1948? He doesn't say, and no one should ask him that. But I think the fact is that he's a real leader, this guy. He's got a lot of guts. I text with him sometimes, and I know when he had like border protection, the bodyguard protection was enhanced on him with threats. I was like, okay, Mansour, is the threats coming all from the right or from the left? He's unflappable, and he says what he says in Hebrew, he says in Arabic, and he's just rare. And Rob said it well, our director, because he was on the trip with Ray, he said, it's impossible not to like this guy. He's like a teddy bear of a politician. But we've not seen leadership like him. And he's I don't know, six seats in the polls. And I do know Jews who said, I'm voting for Mansour, because I've been waiting for 75 years for an Arab leader to say what he says. And I think as Jews, I said, but it's an Islamic party. He goes, whatever, I'll vote for him. And so there's leadership, and there's an understanding of we don't want to live under Hamas. And he calls a spade, and if there's something he doesn't like on the right, he'll say it. But you know, the fact that he said to you that he's ready to be a cabinet minister in Israel, that which no Arab leader has been willing to do for 75 years, I think is a sign of an evolving Israeli-Arab community. And look, also, look, something I know that for Americans in 2024 might sound unusual, but Mansour has said, you know, in this country, minorities have felt the police might be too strong in certain neighborhoods and communities. Mansour's complaint is the Israeli police is not strong enough. He feels there's a lot of crime in Israeli Arab communities. There's a lot of organized crime, and the Israeli police force has not done enough against organized crime in Arab communities. And he says, we need more Israel, give us more police. And that is different than, let's say, in this country among certain minority groups. But I think if I had to say one guy to look for, if you want to follow somebody, and I would follow him. And in terms of as someone who, in my view, is a real leader. Now, again, I'm not saying he represents all Arabs, but you know, people didn't know if you have 4 seats, that's what you need to cross the threshold in the Knesset. He's, I think, usually in a lot of polls, he's at 6, and he's the strongest number of support among Arabs. So that, I think, is an interesting current. I don't want to say his view is the only view, though, so I don't want anyone to misinterpret me. It's not the only view. Clearly, there's some people who are not happy with his views, but he tends to be doing very well at the polls. And October the 7th, he cast a very, I thought, responsible kind of tone and say this is unacceptable terrorism. We can never accept it. And that tone has held it. And a lot of us were worried. I must tell you, I was scared after October 7th there might be some retribution against Israeli Arabs. And that didn't happen. We've seen things in the West Bank that are deplorable in certain villages because of some of the hardline settlers. But the Israeli Arabs and the Israeli Jewish community is active with restraint. And I just want to refer back to what I said before about the Temple Mount Al-Aqsa, that the security services is don't put restrictions on them. It'll backfire. And I think that was the right tone. And I think we're seeing a lot of people step up to the plate in a good way since October 7th.
My final question, before we turn to questions and observations from you, is in almost all of the scenarios for what happens after the end of this cataclysmic war, the Palestinian Authority functions in some way. And so one question is, what would a Palestinian government or political structure look like in a world after the end of the war?
It would look like the exact opposite of what we have right now. Look, I mean, this is the current, maybe take a step back. To what you said, I mean, I think today, if you look at the day after the war, there are basically one of 2 options. There are no other options. Either we have a gradual introduction of the Palestinian Authority or reintroduction into Gaza to ultimately get to a position where it can govern Gaza, or the Israelis are stuck with it. One of the 2 options. You know, we hear these fantastical ideas, get the Arabs in, get whatever, ain't gonna happen. No one's gonna come and basically take responsibility on one of the most volatile pieces of land in this whole region. So it's either the Palestinian Authority in some way, shape, or form, or you break it, you own it, and Israel is going to go back into full occupation, meaning not only security responsibility, but also civilian responsibility over Gaza. All of that said, today the Palestinian Authority is certainly not in a position to take over. And that is basically based on 2 reasons. It doesn't have the actual physical capability of doing this. It's a weak government, just in terms of capabilities. But more importantly, perhaps, it does not have the political legitimacy to do that. If you look at opinion polls, again, taken with a grain of salt, because this poll that I'm going to quote was done during the war, yet, according to credible pollster, 92% of the Palestinians want the current Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, to step down. I just don't see how you can bounce back from 92%, especially when you're 89 years old and very hard to rebrand at this stage of your career. Look, the weakness of the Palestinian Authority is a deep problem, has been and is and will be a deep problem if it's not dealt with. It has been a problem because I believe that a big part of Hamas's popularity is because the PA sucks. It's so bad. I mean, there's a bad joke that says if you're being chased by a shark, you don't have to swim faster than the shark. You have to swim faster than the next guy. And this is exactly what Hamas has been doing. It has been unpopular, yet the PA's lack of legitimacy and popularity has also made sure that Hamas is strengthened. And if you look at the future, the day after Gaza, the fact that the Palestinian Authority is incapable is creating all of these policy anxieties and actually ambiguity that we have to be dealing with right now. Now, how do you fix the PA? You have to look at why the PA is weak. And here I would say the PA is weak for two reasons. It's weak because, PA was created to achieve two objectives. One objective was to be a transitional authority, negotiate with Israel to create a Palestinian state. Obviously failed. Why it failed, we can talk about who's at fault, and my view is everyone's at fault. But the other reason why it was created was to be, to govern the Palestinians in this interim. And here it also failed. The Palestinian Authority basically was created along the same image as the, Mubarak's Egypt or Ben Ali's Tunisia, etc. The same models that gave us the Arab Spring. Today, the majority of the Palestinians believe that the Palestinian Authority is corrupt. The majority of the Palestinians do not trust the Palestinian Authority. When 60-some% tell you it is a liability, not an asset, it is a problem. So the question is, how do you reform it? You reform it, you have kind of the substance and the process. And in some ways, this is easy because we have a blueprint from the past. When George W. Bush came and said in 2002 that the Palestinian Authority needs to deal with corruption, I remember sitting in a meeting with Bush, smiling and nodding politely, etc. In the back of my mind, this is going to happen. When we started, and we heard, I was a Palestinian official at that point, we heard this from Bush, so what do? We run to the Europeans, look at these bad Americans, they want to defund us, they want to play with our domestic politics. We heard the exact same talking points in Paris, London, and Brussels. It eventually sunk in when we heard the exact same talking point. I remember a meeting with the Saudi foreign minister at that time, the late Prince Saud al-Faisal, in which he gave us a lecture about how we need a modern constitution and transparent public finance, which was kind of precious coming from the Saudis at that time. Meaning the US built a coalition. And when you build a coalition like this, the PA is an aid-dependent entity and ultimately has no choice but to implement it. What do you need to implement? To my mind, you need 3 or 4 key elements of reform. Now, there are many, many things that you need to reform, but there are 3 core elements that you need. First is you need a change of leadership. And I think this is essential. Today, the current leadership, Abbas and company, have failed. They're associated with failure. I just do not believe that you can rebrand them. We need to push for new leadership. What this is, we can talk about it in more detail. 2, you need seriousness when it comes to security. And here there's some good news. Today the Palestinian security forces, which have been trained by the US and the Jordanians, are actually professional and far, far cry from what we had under Arafat. Today though you have politicization of the leadership of the security forces, and you need a change of that. You need to create a professional, depoliticized security sector like you see in Jordan, like you see in other successful or functioning, at least, countries in the region. 3, you need to deal with the issue of corruption by creating transparency in the public finance. And again, this is not so hard because during the Bush era, we had a prime minister named Salam Fayyad, who within 2 or 3 years brought the level of kind of the financial transparency up to European levels. And finally, you need to deal with education. You need to deal with education, both as it comes to how Palestinians see Israel, etc., but also you need to deal with education to create an educational view that is not stuck in a narrative of victimhood, but one that is actually more fixated on how do you move forward. And again, here I have, as I think David mentioned, I have hope because I see a homegrown model of this being done in the Gulf that we can import. Give me these 4 areas of reform, and I think we start having the beginnings of a Palestinian Authority that can function. And then, and this is the last point I would make sure that any increased responsibilities that this authority has is based not on kind of some preordained timetable, but on clear benchmarks. You prove that you are capable of running security, we give you security over Gaza City or over Deir al-Balah or this or that. You believe that you show that you can govern on these issues, we give you authorities. And that is true both in terms of reintroducing the PA into Gaza, but as we think in the long term, the idea of Palestinian state, which is today a demand among all Arab countries, it also has to be benchmarked and not based on some artificial timeline. Ultimately, if it's not rooted in the PA's ability to govern, I think any future movement will just fail.
That's why performance-based is the key kind of, term I think for all of you to understand is whether it's in the security, whether it's in the governance area, these things matter. And now you're in this weird moment, and it was just in the Gulf in December, where the Gulf is saying, hey, okay, maybe we're not Jeffersonian Democrats, okay? We're modernizers. We're not, westernizers in terms of democracy, but you want our money to reconstruct Gaza? Well, we want to know where this is going politically because we don't want to give money and then there's bombings all over again. So that's one thing, and that relates to what Ray said earlier about an October 7th, the post-October 7th mood in the Arab world, about having some sort of pathway. They don't expect a Palestinian state tomorrow, but at least the beginnings of a pathway. But on the other hand, we don't want to give money to a PA that is so corrupt that we might as well just write a check to a bank account in Switzerland. You want our money, then we got to know it's going for its intended purposes. And there's a story of the Saudis who paid money for a hospital in the West Bank, and then they came to visit the hospital in 2016, and there was no hospital. It had 100% gone into somebody's pocket. And they said, okay, we're not giving. And for the next 6 years, they didn't give to the Palestinians because of the corruption issue. So, it's the right thing to do on its own terms. It's the one way to build coexistence, I think, with Israel. But it's also, in terms of getting Gulf money, they want to know that the money they're giving it to is going to its intended purposes. So we're at this interesting moment where the Arab states could be a positive here. I mean, I think they have that faith in Salam Fayyad. The person that, when he was prime minister of 2007, 2013, he had great marks in Khalil Shikaki's polls. He's the leading pollster in Ramallah. He built schools, he built roads, he built clinics, he built water treatment centers, he brought parks, he brought sports fields, he did all this stuff. And Abbas's numbers were higher too in 2007 and 2013. But the problem is that I think Fayyad is somewhat a threat to Abbas, who's very old school, who has got his sons and his relatives and his, it's not just patronage jobs. It's not like it's Chicago, but it's something much more serious. And I think that the governance piece of Richard's question is crucial to get confidence among the Arabs to give the amount of money that you need to rebuild. So, I think that is a piece, and I don't know how this is going to be solved because it comes down to the United States doing something we don't like to do, which is telling somebody, who's 89 years old in this case, hey, you get to be the King of England. Like, you can be ceremonial, but you need a prime minister who is in power. And he doesn't like that, and we also are not comfortable playing that role. And the Arabs, though, when you say, this has to happen, this has to happen, this has to happen, and they go, okay, will you tell Abbas? Oh no, we're not talking. That's the United States. And then we have a certain tendency in our bureaucracy that Rafe and I know very well. I can't get very explicit with names here, But, we don't want to tell an Arab leader who their leaders are. And I understand that, but it's not like he's about to hold an election and we're blocking an election. It's that he doesn't want an election and he wants to dictate who the leaders are. And yes, they're corrupt, and yes, they're not going to inspire confidence. And how is the money going to come? Well, I really don't know how the money's going to come. I mean, they don't connect the dots here. And we're kind of a little too reticent on our side about making our views known. And that is the missing piece, so to speak, here.
Just one quick point that since you mentioned, you raised the issue of coexistence with Israel. I mean, in all of this, and I should have said this earlier, one thing to ensure the failure of any reform is if the Israelis do not respond positively. I think if you want to make sure that reform is successful, if there is serious reform coming from the Palestinians, Israel has to respond. And I think if you mentioned this Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, if he was with us today, and you ask him, why did you fail in that period? He will say yes. Both Abbas and Hamas attacked him, but the Israelis did not let's say, respond positively to some of the reforms he did. And, both David and I know, because we talked to Israeli security in particular, there was a time when the IDF and the Shin Bet, when Fayyad was Prime Minister, was saying, give the Palestinians something to show that his way actually produces results. And for whatever reason, the political echelon was more reluctant. So that's one lesson learned. If we see a serious reform process, then Israel should also reciprocate in ways that do not threaten its security, but shows that when you start having a serious Palestinian leadership, that there is a positive response coming from Israel.
Just one thing, I could add just one thing on this. And here's something like, this is a nice side that you don't see. And by the way, Rafe was not calling for Israel to embrace Fayyad. There would be a bear hug to him. It would be counterproductive. He wasn't saying that. But so I would always go to Ramallah, and I'd visit him as Prime Minister. And Rafe and I are in touch with him. And in some ways, I go to Princeton, and I see him where he's teaching. So I'm sitting with him when he's Prime Minister. And so this was right before he resigned, I think 2013, and it might have been 2012. And he said, David, I'm the only Palestinian, before I go to sleep at night, I read Zionist history. And I said, really? You saw him? He goes, yeah. And he said, the Zionists, they were geniuses. He said, our job is to emulate Zionism. I said, what do you mean? He said, because, if you look at the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and you look at the partition plan of 1947. In those 30 years, the Zionists, they built Israel. They didn't know for sure when the state would be formed, but they had faith, and that faith was incredible. And they built, he didn't know all the names. I said, the university. I said, Hebrew U. He goes, yeah, that one. And I said, and the sick fund, I said, Hebrew, they call it Kupat Cholim. He said, yeah, that. And then the trade union, Histadrut. And we went through it. And he said, and he went through it, but I don't know, we went through about 12 different institutions that the Zionists built. And he goes, that was brilliant. The Jews were brilliant. He said, how they did that? He said, I told that to Arafat. And Arafat said, first we declare, then we figure it out. And he goes, no. We have to build institutions. Strong institutions. Those are the pillars of statehood. And the fact that he drew strength from what Israel did, I think is astonishing. It's not something maybe in a public speech he would talk about on Al Jazeera. Well, he wouldn't go on Al Jazeera. They wouldn't welcome him. But it is something very important for this audience to understand.
Well, we still have a little bit of time. We've run over my division of time, but we still have some time for some questions. And it's very important that they be questions so that in the limited time that we have, we can have a few questions. So let me begin. Noah, are you, can you carry the microphone around for us? So you have to speak into the microphone so that we get it.
Maybe if we ask the student ask the first question.
Yeah, so let's ask Malcolm. Go ahead, right here.
I'm sorry, I'll be quick. David, what you just ended with seemed to me to be exactly the opposite of what you were saying before. You said that we need benchmarks. The question is, who is we and who can impose sanctions when benchmarks are not met. At the end, you said it's chaos or so, and nobody can do much. And so I'm wondering who enforces the benchmarks?
Oh, that's a great question about who's going to determine the criteria by which a benchmark has been met. And I think that, frankly, is going to something
That's easy to do. Who's going to enforce something when it's not met?
Right, or when it's not met. I mean, look, it's clear that if the Palestinians don't meet the benchmarks on security, Israel is not going to want to transfer more authority. I mean, I think that is clear. The question is going to be one of interpretation. What if, you have a set of criteria the U.S., Israel, and the Palestinians agree on? There will be, the Palestinians will say, well, I want someone who's an arbiter here that, that we could trust. What if the government is not led by Benny Gantz? It's led by somebody else. And I think that's going to be a big question of who kind of determines whether criteria are met. I think if they're not met, Israel will definitely make its voices heard, and then we'll get into the interpretation, and the U.S. will probably weigh in. But I think you raised a very important question here about what happens when there's differences over interpretation.
Again, I would say very quickly that it can't be the U.S. alone. The U.S. needs to build and lead a coalition. We had models in the past. We had something called the Quartet, etc. But the U.S. should basically bring the different stakeholders who can both create incentive and pressure on the different parties to ensure that at a certain point, if a benchmark is met, then the Israelis are reticent. How do you pressure them? If a benchmark is not met, how do you get, say, the Arabs to pressure the Palestinians? So you need this, but without U.S. leadership, I just don't see it happening. And this is, to be honest, one of the biggest frustrations I see right now with U.S. policy is that we have all of these aspirations, but as of yet, we have not created the political or diplomatic momentum to create a coalition of the willing, if you wish, that can push this.
Just a question on Israeli politics. So with the Haredim drafting bill right now, it's extremely contentious. There's already talks of the government collapsing. Is that likely? Do you think so? And then going forward, what are the odds of people coming back into politics like Naftali Bennett, who brought in Mansour Abbas, who both of you spoke very highly of?
Good questions. I asked that question to Benny Gantz last Monday before he went to the White House. So, telepathy. Look, it's clear that he would like to use, and I don't know for the audience, I hope this doesn't sound a little esoteric, but it's really central. The whole Haredi, the draft law issue is that now Israel is thinking it needs a stronger army after October 7th. They want to raise the reserve age up to 40, back up to 46. It was once 54, it went down to 40. Now they want to bring it back up to 46. The mandatory for males, I think, was 3 years. It had gone down to 2 years and 8 months. They want to bring it back to 3. Some say maybe even go above it. They want to increase the number of reserve days. All these things are going to put more pressure on Israeli society. In the middle of all this, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, think that the payoff for them in joining this government at the end of 2022 was that they would get a blank check, that they would be permanently exempt from the draft. And Bibi had understood this was like a volcanic thing before October 7th. I think it's mission impossible today. I saw the chief Sephardic rabbi weighed in to say, oh, well, if we don't get what we want, then we're going to go abroad. Now, he's supposed to be, by the way, a bureaucrat of the state. He's not a political leader. But I don't know too many countries that would say, oh, we would take tens of thousands of Kollel students and we'll pay monthly stipends for you to stay in the yeshiva. So, I don't know where they think they're going to get a better deal than the state of Israel. And someone say, make my day. Go for it. Go, leave. Good luck to you. Yeah, Lapid said it. So, I think he said he had a line, Lapid said something like, what you'll find is if you go abroad, you got to work for a living. That's what I think Lapid said. So, having said all that, I think Gantz wants to talk to he's always been wanting to keep the doors open because he's always thought that was the ultra-Orthodox were key to a broader-based government. So he wants to talk to them. He said to me, he said, like, they're crazy, they're suicidal. They think they can push a law through with everything going on in this country. So I think he wants to say, what about if we defer the issue for a year, but you agree to elections in September? So whether that works, I don't know. Your second point about Mansour, what was, about Bennett and, So look, his numbers on 37, it's a very interesting question because there's a softness in the 37 figure. When, like Naftali's name is, and Naftali sent me this on a WhatsApp, but when his name is put out there, Gantz goes from 37 to 23. And so I think what Bennett's been able to do, when he did a great job last time as prime minister, is say, look, I might be right of center, but I want to rule by consensus. I want center right and center left and all of us to work together. And the public likes that. They like the idea of unity. And like I said, instead of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir going up, actually those who call for unity, those are the numbers that have gone up. But I think it tells me that if Bennett is at 14 and like Bennett and Gantz is at 23, so that's 37 together. Yossi Cohen, a former head of the Mossad, is also polls around there. I think what it tells me is there's a right of center vote that is just not Bibi. You know, they're right of center, but they want a different leader. They wouldn't like Bennett. They would like, I think, Nir Barkat, a former head of Jerusalem, mayor of Jerusalem, who was a high-tech guy out in California in the Silicon Valley. His checkpoint, they made a lot of money. They want someone with, but they want a unifier. And so, to me, there is a softness in the Gantz number, but it's a right-of-center figure who preaches that same unity, consensus approach as Gantz. So I do think the numbers are soft, but I think it's soft in a good way that, there are some right-of-center people who are part, but people have made up their views on Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he hasn't been able to really recover since October 7th, because it seems to me.
So we have a question. We have time for one more question, and we'll take the gentleman in the back who has a hand.
Thank you. Thank you for this conversation. I'd love to hear, if we had more time, where you two disagree. I'd love to hear a lot more about where you disagree, because I think that would be instructive for us to hear, but also to model the disagreement in the way that you are so nicely. My question, we talked a little about PR, but the conversation that you've had today was so geopolitical. But the conversation that's happening kind of in the PR world, particularly on college campuses, has become very focused and ethnocentric. And so the language we haven't heard today, genocide, ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, apartheid, and competing definitions of Zionism, is where we hear much of the conversation occurring. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on the distance between that conversation and the kind of conversation that you are having. And if that isn't a serious conversation, it sure is having serious impact. And so how is that impact problematic?
Great question.
I start with a difficult question, Look, first of all, one of the reasons that we do what we do like this is to actually show that there is a possibility of a different conversation. Because I do think that that conversation, which to my mind, by the way, is one that is, from a substantive point of view, useless, though it is important, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But we actually want to model that there is a policy conversation to be had, and the policy conversation is not obvious. I mean, I think it's very hard to take out of this, a very strong, pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, pro-anything out of it. We're trying to show some of the difficult issues that you have to work through if you want to create policy. And you see convergence, because ultimately in the world of policy, the realistic options are quite limited. There aren't really that many realistic options. We remove a lot of, let's say like the idea of Palestinian state tomorrow, or binational state, or that kind of nonsense. It's out of the conversation because it is not a serious policy topic. Again, we want to model that if you want to have a policy conversation, it's more complicated. Yet, the reality is, as you rightly said, that conversation creates maybe not a policy impact, but a political impact. And we see it actually, we're in an election year right now. So you see that this very polarized conversation is creating anxiety among the political classes. And today, if you go to the White House, and we see this kind of in every election year, the policy voices slowly make way to the political voices. Maybe if, a few months ago, Jake Sullivan or whoever had the president's ear, today it's the political team that has the president's ear. This conversation that we see, this polarized conversation is damaging in this way. And the problem is that it's a conversation that does not lend itself to a rational discussion. I can give you what I think is a very strong argument why the label apartheid doesn't apply. From a legal point of view, from even I would say moral point of view, it doesn't apply. I can give you actually, don't look at me, I can look at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, that basically has made very strong indication that what's happening in Israel right now is not genocide. Let's talk about the issue of rape. The vaunted UN, where every activist in front of the UN has just come out and said there were rapes on October 7th, and it has not seeped into the conversation. This is a different kind of conversation. It's one that I actually tell you the truth, I don't know how to approach, but this is not the job of a policy person to approach. This is a job of two kinds of people. It's the job of political leaders to approach it. And unfortunately, on the Palestinian and Israeli side today, we do not have leaders who are willing to come and say difficult things. Actually, they're very happy in pushing that same thing, because each are looking at their echo chamber, which is their support base, and they're feeding it. And certainly our politicians don't want to wade into this. This is too toxic, etc. But it's also something that I'm going to throw back the challenge at you. People like David and myself, we come to a campus, our day job is not this, our day job is to do our policy stuff in DC. We come to a campus, we do what we do, we leave. We have a problem with campus leaders that are throughout this country, be it the administration, be it actual professors, and we are not seeing the counter voice coming from within the communities, be it, again, campuses, etc. So I think without having a solid center emerging from the kind of the people who influence public discourse, and here I think university professors and university leaders are key components of this. If we do not have clarity in terms of what is a reasonable conversation, and by the way, I'm a very strong First Amendment person, and I do believe in protection for the most vile kind of speech. Yet I do believe that as a university, people have leaderships and professors also have their own First Amendment right to come out and say, wait a minute, this is stupid, and this is actually the kind of conversation we would like to see here. So this is a challenge. I think it's a multi-faceted challenge. We give you maybe a window into the policy world, that there's a lot of small policy differences that we have. That means the world to DC, and means absolutely nothing to you here. But I do believe that we are presenting one voice, but there are other voices that need to step up to the task, and unfortunately they have not stepped up.
Good.
Amen. Well said. And we, like you see, we agree, the two of us, more than we disagree. We might have differences over some topics, but we'll leave that for another time. But I do think that this point of leadership is crucial. I mean, for us, we want to focus on the policy because that's what we do. We think we want to model civility for students, that you can disagree without being disagreeable. But the whole idea of a university should be, an exchange of views and looking for common assumptions and we think just that if this was I like sports analogies, if this was a football field, if there's no common assumptions, people are just shouting at each other from one end zone to the next end zone across 100 yards. Well, if you had people more in the center, around the 40, 50 yard line, you could say, here we have some common assumptions, here's where we disagree. I mean, I have on my wall a sign of Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I think it was a great American. And he said everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but not to their own set of facts. And for me, that is always key in this kind of modeling that we want to do of civility, is where are the facts we agree on? Like, you can't say the word genocide when Israel's telling 1.1 million Palestinians, here, take this road so no one gets hurt, right? And the ICJ realizes that too, in The Hague. So, I mean, there's just basic things, but, if everything becomes so ethnocentric that we can't even agree on basic facts, but people are hurling outrageous epithets just to hurt, one side, to me, we don't have a discussion. All we have is shouting, and we're not getting anywhere. That's why we do what we do, is we feel like we want to, what we hope is elevate the conversation by going to campuses, more light, less heat. I mean, it's just ironic that Washington used to always be about keeping up with the campuses in many ways in the past, but this is the one issue where the epithets are so, and I'm not trying to say it's equal on both sides, by the way. I'm not saying that. But the epithets are such that we feel, hey, this is like, we got to elevate this conversation because it's nowhere. It's just nowhere. And as you see, we don't do the recriminations. We don't do the finger pointing. Our job is to say, okay, where is their general agreement and where can we build on that agreement? And I'm sorry to say, and hopefully I'm not ending on a controversial note, but I sat with a provost of a university, and recently, 25,000 students. And I said, where I went to school, and I was blessed, I'm lucky to, Rafe went to great schools, he went to Oxford, I was at Columbia and Harvard. We had to understand conflicts. We had to understand the history of a conflict. We had to understand the geography of the conflict. What river, what sea. We had to understand the demography of a conflict. We had to understand the socioeconomics of a conflict. We had to understand governing structures of a conflict. To reduce everything into who is an oppressor and who's an oppressed is so outrageous. And when you have an oppressed who's an oppressor, I mean, the permutations are endless. There is no substitute for understanding, the basics of a conflict, trying to map it out, trying to create coalitions, maybe peace groups. I know you can't say the word peace in certain places anymore, but finding ways, what do we agree on? How do we build on that? And maybe it's even taking alternative spring break groups to each other's communities in different parts of the world to help each other to build. And that's what, the thing that breaks my heart is that this conflict is tearing campuses apart when we should be going from the ground up on how to build coalitions together to bring people together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time with Rafe and David. We'd love to have you back, and we will try to do that. But I'd like to thank Hillel and Congregation B'nai B'rith and the leadership of both of those institutions for creating this afternoon and lunchtime with Ghaith al-Omari and David Makovsky. So please join me in thanking them and Hillel.